Hello, and welcome to Middleside Topwise, where we challenge the status quo. If you're not interested in or accustomed to challenging the status quo, this video is going to bother you. In the original Were the Beatles Racist?, which is now available on Patreon due to copyright, we discussed how the Fab Four poorly appropriated American skiffle music and became popular amongst an overtly racist British audience that was clamoring for whitewashed versions of black culture. In the West, people who are perceived as white receive benefits that people who are not perceived as white do not receive. If this fact makes you uncomfortable, that means you are a human being with a soul. You should feel uncomfortable that there's a system of oppression that benefits you. This doesn't mean that you aren't talented, or a hard worker, or have not experienced hardship.
I come from a council estate, and
A council or
estate, like council houses. Not poor people, but not well off. You didn't own your own
public
house.
housing.
Public housing.
Right.
Where a lot of people all live together and stuff. So I'm from there, and my family never had any money. So to have money, yeah, I'm not born to it at all. So whenever anyone says, "Nah, you got too much money, yeah, you should pay, you could give it all away or something," that can make me feel a bit embarrassed, because I don't really know what to say to them. Except, well, look, I didn't rip anyone off to get it. I didn't rip anyone off to get it.
I will continue to assert that the Beatles rose to fame not because of their unique skills as musicians and songwriters, but because they were more palatable to the mainstream than their black counterparts. This is racism. After becoming the artistic beneficiaries of white supremacy, the Beatles would go on to write obnoxious songs like as well as Get Back, which originally included insensitive lyrics about Pakistani and Puerto Rican people.
Don't dig no Pakistanis taking all the people's jobs.
Now, if you want to hear a song that properly mocks racist British attitudes, go listen to The Clash's Straight to Hell. More on that later. By far the most egregious example of the Beatles' not-so-quiet racism is John Lennon's, where he literally says on the Dick Cavett show that the N-word has changed meaning. I'm not kidding.
It does not have the same meaning as it used to, and I think he put it very succinctly there, and I really believe women have the worst. Whatever it is, however badly or poor people are, it's the woman that takes it when they get home from work.
Every white person is racist until we start doing the work to understand how we have personally benefited from and contribute to racism. You become a part of the problem when you refuse to stand up to this system, or even worse, start making edgy jokes about it in an attempt to deflect from the fact that you are complicit.
Well, we're both islands, and we're both little, and we both did this, and we both did that. And we find ourselves turning quite fascist discussing it.
We do.
The Beatles have supported the right causes in public, while promoting a very flippant and reductive view of the systemic racism they benefited from and contributed to. In this video, we will cover many of the comments we received in response to the first, and provide more context to the statement that the Beatles were racist. Listen, I know the Beatles have a lot of great songs. Here's a short list off the top of my head of ones that I enjoy. But when Quincy Jones and Little Richard say they aren't very good musicians, I'm sorry, I'm going to listen to them before I listen to a boomer with nostalgia blindness.
So he offered me half of the Beatles, and I never thought they was going no place, and so I didn't take it. To me, and they got this hollow, woo, woo, they would say, woo, woo, and then...
So why don't we hear from the boys themselves on the subject?
As a group, we're the first to say that we're not all that good anyway, musically.
He taught us a lot, and I'm sure we taught him a lot by our sort of primitive musical ability, which is all I have still,
As a drummer, I know Ringo is a great drummer, but he is bad. He doesn't practice. And it's the same with me. People call me a guitar player. And in a way, I'm a guitar player, but I never practice. There's years and years in my life where I never pick the guitar up except just to make a record. But I know I could be quite good, but I don't practice enough.
Or how about producer George Martin?
I was running Parlophone, which was a small label in England, and I've been doing this for about 12 years. In 1962, Brian Epstein walked into my office with a record of this group called the Beatles, which I thought was such a stupid name. So corny with an A. And they weren't very good. It was a funny kind of sound. I thought, well, if you want me to judge it on this, forget it. It wasn't at all obvious that they could be songwriters at that stage, because their songs were pretty awful. But even then, Love Me Do was the best thing.
Or some of their contemporaries, like Bob Dylan.
What the English thing did was they just proved that you could make money, you know, at playing, you know, the same old kind of music that you used to play.
Yeah, early on.
And that's the truth. You know, that's not a lie, and it's not a come on or nothing. But you know, the English people can't play rock and roll music.
Or David Bowie.
How do you feel about contemporaries like the Rolling Stones and, say, Paul McCartney, who are totally different kettle of fish?
In what way?
I mean, do you respect their music? Do you like their music?
I like some mixed things. I don't like much of Paul's. He's a nice guy.
Or Lou Reed.
I never liked the Beatles. I thought they were garbage.
So at this point, we have to talk about Bernard Purdie, who has come out on numerous occasions saying that he re-recorded 21 Beatles songs in place of Ringo Starr.
The real part that hurts is that the people do not understand fixing records was a way of life. In the 60s and the 70s, 98% of the groups, self-contained groups, are not on their own albums. And what I was doing was going in. I was one of the few drummers who could actually go in, join the group, and make the records. Because the record companies were paying a lot of money to make these records happen. The Beatles' music was just another job for me. Another job. Because half of the songs that I played on 21 tracks of the Beatles. Half of them had no drums. Because they kicked him out in the beginning. And the whole point is that whether you realize it or not, whether you want to believe it or not, it becomes irrelevant at this point. But you're going to find out that he's not on anything. There are 4 drummers on the Beatles' music. Ringo is not one of them.
In contrast, let's hear from the type of person that appreciates the Beatles.
Paul McCartney, terrific.
The Beatles were great at listening, taking notes, and imitating. All artists do that to a degree, but the Beatles excelled at it. Like Warhol, they took something familiar, modified it in just the right way to catch your attention, and sold it at a profit. They were then given incredible opportunities, limited to a select few, purely based on their appearance. This is a video titled, "White Audience Realizes Frankie Lyman is Black." Before this, people consumed music exclusively on the radio and on records. In America, despite the prevalence of intense racism, it was generally understood that black people were writing the majority of these songs. In the UK, however, things were different. If you look at the UK pop charts, which started in 1952, you'll notice a distinct difference in tone, shall we say. Elvis Presley managed to make it over there, as did Jerry Lee Lewis, Buddy Holly, the Everly Brothers, and Pat Boone. What we do not see is their American contemporaries Little Richard, Ray Charles, Sam Cooke, or Nat King Cole, who all had major hits in the US during that time. The only black artists I can find on the UK charts are Harry Belafonte and the classic track Why Do Fools Fall in Love by the Teenagers, fronted by a one Frankie Lyman. We can plainly see that in the midst of the civil rights movement in America, there was a serious demand for amenable white artists in the UK, and the Beatles fit that mold to a T. In 1971, John Lennon told Rolling Stone that the song Your Blues is a self-conscious recognition of his and other British artists' poor appropriation of black American bluesmen, and goes on to say that their early work was a parody of black R&B singers.
Beatles super self-conscious people about parodying Americans, which we do and have done. I know we developed our own style, but we still, in a way, parody American music.
Their music was not some grand homage to the creators of rock and roll. When asked about his influences sometime in the 80s, George Harrison names 3 white artists and is barely able to name any black musicians.
Who do you think is the best guitarist? Because you actually are a guitarist.
Best guitarist, living or not living?
Both?
Well, there's a lot of guitar players. I like a guy called Eddie Lang and a guy called Django Reinhardt. And these days, I think there's out of the contemporary players, I think Eddie Van Halen's pretty hot. I like, of course, Eric Clapton. I like a lot of the old blues players, you know, like, many of them, like Robert Johnson.
I don't know the guy.
Yeah.
He does, however, make it a point to name his best friend, Eric Clapton. So much for all that credit, huh? Segregation was legally outlawed in America by the Civil Rights Act of 1964. That same year, the Beatles refused to play to a segregated audience in Jacksonville, Florida.
There's never any segregation in concerts in England, and in fact, if there was, we probably wouldn't play them.
This is not even remotely true. Pubs and venues all over the UK absolutely were racially segregated via the unspoken colour bar, which prompted the creation of the League of Coloured People in 1931. In 1958, when the Fab Four were in their teens, hundreds of white English men wreaked havoc on West Indian neighborhoods for 2 weeks straight after an argument between an interracial couple was witnessed at a local train station. These vicious attacks on British minorities would be referred to as the Notting Hill Race Riots. Racial discrimination in the UK was made illegal via the Race Relations Act of 1965. But even then, there was a distinct racial bias against people of color in many institutions, such as Buckingham Palace, who have never formally abolished their discriminatory hiring practices, instead choosing to highlight the fact that people from ethnic minority backgrounds have been employed since the 1990s. To this day, the Beatles don't seem to be aware of any of this.
Way back in the 1960s, there was a lot of fun being had by people, but there was also a lot of troubles going on, and particularly in the southern states in America over civil rights. There was a lot of troubles going on there, and we would hear about it. We'd see it on the TV or in the newspapers, and I wanted to try and write a song that would kind of sum up what I felt about the whole thing and symbolize my feelings. And maybe if it got to some of the people suffering in Arkansas or Little Rock, then maybe it just might bring them a little bit of hope, a little bit of inspiration for the future. So that was what's next.
Wait a second. Are you telling me that the song Blackbird is literally about black people? The song that goes, "You were only waiting for this moment to be free"? I mean, that's not the N-word has changed meaning and I'm allowed to use it now level ignorant, but it's pretty damn close. That show in Jacksonville was attended by Kitty Oliver, a young black woman who secretly listened to, quote, the white radio station at night, introducing her to the Fab Four. From her account, it seems as though she was the only black person at the show that evening. We can go on and on about all the notable black musicians that have shown respect for the Beatles over the years, but what I want someone to do is show me some black people that grew up in the 1960s that love the band. I don't think very many exist. Okay, so the reason the KKK didn't like the Beatles is because John Lennon said they were bigger than Jesus. It had nothing to do with their views on race. Moving on. In 1969, tensions were high amongst the band, and so one day, George Harrison asked keyboard player Billy Preston to sit in on a Get Back session. Harrison says he did this because John and Paul were acting strange, and he knew the others loved Billy. Afterwards, Preston would sign to Apple Records, with Harrison producing his next two albums. Both feature Eric Clapton on guitar.
Don't you remember I told you I'm a soldier in the war on poverty?
Preston would leave the label soon after, and despite making records throughout the 70s and 80s, struggled with drug and alcohol abuse until his death at the age of 59 in 2006. But don't worry, his talents would be utilized by the greats right up to the end, with Preston touring with Clapton as late as 2004, fully in the throes of kidney disease. Neither Clapton, McCartney, or any of the Rolling Stones, with whom he also toured, would attend the 3-hour funeral ceremony that featured performances from Joe Cocker, Little Richard, and The Temptations. Oh yeah, here's an article I found about Eric Clapton's Venice Beach estate that was built in 1986 and put on the market in 2017. I wonder why all these rock legends decided to pass up a trip down to Inglewood. So in the last video, I briefly stated that I had nothing bad to say about George Harrison. I was so very wrong. It's common knowledge that the Beatles were deeply influenced by Eastern spirituality. It can also be said that they helped instigate a neo-colonial movement that appropriated Indian culture in an attempt to absolve themselves of the realities of white Western capitalism. Without getting into their entire history with the Maharishi, many sources point to the Beatles' journey to India as the beginning of Western spiritual tourism, and their adoption of transcendental meditation as the birth of the human potential movement, later rebranded as the New Age movement. Later in life, the enlightened writer of the proto-libertarian anthem Taxman had some interesting words for those who refuse to work. "I don't mind anybody dropping out of anything, but it's the imposition on somebody else I don't like. The moment you start dropping out and then begging off of somebody else to help you, then it's no good. It doesn't matter what you are as long as you work." In contrast, contemporary of the Beatles, activist Mario Savio once said,
"There's a time when the operation of the machine becomes so odious, makes you so sick at heart, that you can't take part. You can't even passively take part. And you've got to put your bodies upon the gears and upon the wheels, upon the levers, upon all the apparatus, and you've got to make it stop. And you've got to indicate to the people who run it, to the people who own it, that unless you're free, the machine will be prevented from working at all."
The Rig Veda, the ancient Indian text which Harrison claimed to spend the second half of his life studying, also says otherwise.
"Bounteous is he who gives unto the beggar who comes to him in want of food, and the feeble success attends him in the shout of battle. He makes a friend of him in future troubles. No friend is he who to his friend and comrade who comes imploring food will offer nothing. Let the rich satisfy the poor implorer, and bend his eye upon a longer pathway. Riches come now to one, now to another, and like the wheels of cars are ever rolling, the foolish man wins food with fruitless labor. That food, I speak the truth, shall be his ruin."
George Harrison died in 2001 with a net worth of $100 million, which he left to his wife and only child. He was also known to occasionally work with UNICEF and Greenpeace, which are not at all short on ambassadors or donations. If you look right underneath the surface, you can clearly see a thread of white privileged individualism in George Harrison's spiritual evolution, to use the term very loosely. All he cared about was having the experience the church told him he wasn't allowed to have. As someone who studied a lot of the same traditions as George Harrison, I actually own a copy of this book, and have considered writing a video essay about how the Hare Krishna movement is a far-right cult. What got me going down that road was this line from the preface.
"The whole world is eager to satisfy the dormant propensity of love for others, but the various invented methods like socialism, communism, altruism, humanitarianism, and nationalism are all useless and frustrating because of our gross ignorance of the art of loving Krishna."
Swami Prabhupada also believed that black people deserved to live in bondage and valued the Indian caste system. Pause to read. He would also go on to say that Hitler was a hero for trying to exterminate the Jewish people, whom he believed were engaging in devious financial manipulation. To top it all off, Prabhupada was a creationist, denied the moon landing, and believed women were untrustworthy and stupid. George Harrison referred to this man as, quote, "my master," and a perfect example of everything he preached. Anyway, Savoy Truffle is a song written by George Harrison for the White Album, which takes a lyrical swipe at the song Obla Di Obla Da, which was Paul's attempt at channeling the then burgeoning genre of Jamaican ska. It's also said to be about Eric Clapton's fetish for exotic chocolates, with Clapton dating singer Betty Davis for a short period during that time. Smash cut to 1991, where George was quoted to say, "Rap music is just computerized crap. I listen to Top of the Pops and after 3 songs I feel like killing someone." Mind you, the Top of the Pops that year featured performances from MC Hammer, CNC Music Factory, and A Tribe Called Quest. But just like his forays into spirituality, I don't think George is all too keen on understanding the differences. At this point, we need to talk about the cover of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. The iconic photo features a total of 71 figures on it, 2 wax dummies, 2 instances of each band member, 6 Indian teachers, 54 white people, and just 1 black person, boxer Sonny Liston. No bluesmen, no civil rights leaders, and certainly no Jimi Hendrix, which they clearly stole their whole style from. Lennon also personally requested 3 figures who were removed later: Gandhi, Jesus Christ, and Adolf Hitler. Yeah, this is just weird. If we were to make a Who's the Most Racist 1960s Rock Star tier list, I'm gonna have to put Ringo at the very bottom, as the only thing I can really criticize him for is covering that one song about dating an underage girl.
You cannot say peace and love and see a guy on the ground with someone's knee in his throat. That's not very peace and loving. At 19, I was trying to emigrate to Houston, Texas because of Lightning Hopkins. And of course, Stevie Wonder, Ray Charles, Little Richard, no one finer. There's so many.
Next up, we have Paul, who goes in the C tier for centrist, or I don't see race. While generally avoiding any political statements throughout the years, he said in response to BLM that all of us here support and stand alongside all those who are protesting and raising their voices at this time, and was not able to muster the words Black Lives Matter at any point in his single social media post on the subject. Next up is George, who we just covered is a huge piece of shit, and in the A tier, we have John Lennon. Multiple websites quote John Lennon as saying, "We all have Hitler in us, but we also have love and peace. So why not give peace a chance for once?" I'm sorry, what? We have what in us? I don't know. No, I don't have that. Finally, in the SS tier, we have... During a trip to London, Hendrix showed up to a Cream gig and boldly asked if he could get up on stage. He immediately began playing the song Killing Floor, which Clapton was known for avoiding due to its technical difficulty. Effortless in his attempt, Jimmy began playing behind his head, between his legs, and with his teeth in an audacious spectacle that left everyone in the room stunned. Clapton was reported to have been the most devastated by the performance, who was found backstage shaking, unable to light his cigarette. All he was able to say was, "Is he really that good?" In 1968, Eric Clapton talked to Rolling Stone about the state of modern music at the time. After praising the Grateful Dead, The Who, and Pink Floyd for their creative approaches to rock and roll, he begins his thoughts on Jimi Hendrix by saying, "I don't like to watch him too much because I prefer to listen to him." He then goes on to fetishize Hendrix, claiming his success is due to the most common of black stereotypes, while calling him this term multiple times. He ends this series of backhanded compliments by saying that Hendrix is doing too much on stage, and makes it a point to shout out the Western scene, which is a blatant dog whistle implying that Hendrix exists within a white-dominated system. At this point, I think the interviewer knows what's up, with the very next question seeming to bait Clapton into more racist ignorance. "Who started the hair thing?" he asks. In response, Clapton credits Bob Dylan for inspiring him to go get his hair curled and blown out. What's really funny is that, if you go look up the afro on Wikipedia, the very first picture is of the great Billy Preston, who rocked the style well into the 1970s. Another iconic afro of the time was that of Betty Davis, who again dated Clapton for a time, but refused to collaborate with him because she thought his music was boring. This 1973 article of Ebony magazine states that the hairstyle was popularized by black revolutionaries in 1965. This is what Bob Dylan looked like in 1965. Here's what he looked like in 1966.
Boo this man!
6 years after the Beatles' failed attempt to write an anti-Enoch Powell anthem, Clapton showed his unabashed support for the far-right British MP, who had just recently reiterated his aggressive anti-immigration stance earlier that year. Not only does Clapton condemn the existence of black and Arabic people in England, he calls for their immediate removal from the venue. Luckily, nothing of the sort occurred, with the audience more confused than supportive. Clapton has blamed his vitriol on a backstage interaction with a Saudi prince, who took a pass at his girlfriend, Pattie Boyd. Ironically, Pattie Boyd is the inspiration for the song Layla, which takes its title from the Arabic narrative poem Layla and Majnun. At the time, Boyd was also George Harrison's wife. Pattie would leave George in 1977, only to endure sexual and physical abuse from Clapton for the next 10 years. Cancel culture does not exist. Not and acquitted for under the Race Relations Act. The National Front was formed in 1966 to, quote, convert racial populists angry about immigration into fascists.
We need to take action, stand firm against the Chinese Communist Party and foreign influence and interference in American research, education, and public affairs.
In 1974, the group launched its NF Trade Unionist Association and was known to recruit new members at football matches and other large public gatherings. A few months before this, David Bowie doubled down on previous statements that he believed strongly in fascism and praised Hitler for being one of the first rock stars. It was also around this time that Bowie began to rebuke the black music he appropriated with John Lennon on the song Fame in favor of his new Thin White Duke persona, which he described as a very Aryan fascist type, a would-be romantic with absolutely no emotion. The accompanying White Light tour was heavily inspired by German Expressionism, Brechtian theater, and colder, more detached music like that of Kraftwerk. According to him, the original title of the tour, Isolar, is a combination of the words isolation and solar, two very common themes in far-right ideology. While in communist Poland, he and bandmate Iggy Pop were detained for traveling with books by Nazi thought leaders Joseph Goebbels and Albert Speer. Later that year, the Jewish activist, artist, and unfortunately named Caroline Kuhn threw a New Year's Eve party at her basement flat in West London, which was attended by punk luminaries Malcolm McLaren, Sid Vicious, and Susie Sue, who all arrived wearing swastika armbands.
Did you wake up in the middle of the night with an idea?
No, it was based on an idea that from talking to a friend of mine who produced the Sex Pistols, a British group.
This immediately got the attention of the Rastas running the sound system, who then began packing up their equipment. When the Clash manager Bernie Rhodes got wind of it, he refused to let his band share the stage with anyone wearing the symbol. These public calls for a neo-fascist movement led to the formation of Rock Against Racism, a confederation of artists, journalists, and fans who were not just not racist, but actively against the promotion of racist values. On August 13th, 1977, 500 National Front members organized a march across southeast London, which was met by over 4,000 anti-fascist protesters. Instead of canceling the event, Metropolitan Commissioner of Police David McNee instead decided to send 5,000 police officers to protect the group's right to demonstrate, claiming an orchestrated and violent attempt by extremists to prevent the march from taking place. Within a few years, RAR expanded to Germany and Austria's Rock gegen Rechts festivals, as well as the Boston-based Rock Against Sexism in the US, which blended anti-racism with third-wave feminism and is now considered to be a precursor to the 90s Riot Girl movement. Rock Against Racism also influenced the formation of the Anti-Nazi League, and in 1985, the UK organization simply known as Anti-Fascist Action. Although supported by acts like The Clash, Steel Pulse, Buzzcocks, The Specials, and Pete Townsend of The Who, neither Clapton, Bowie, nor any of the Beatles have ever shown interest in Rock Against Racism. Now, why do you think that is? The National Front's response to Rock Against Racism was, of course, Rock Against Communism, because we all know the opposite of racism is communism. Just a few months after Clapton's live cover of Enoch Powell's Rivers of Blood speech, he was interviewed by Barbara Sharon for Sounds magazine. Describing his rant as great truth, she is clearly sympathetic to his white supremacist rhetoric. Meanwhile, Clapton thinks it was quite funny and claims to know nothing about politics. Over the years, Clapton and his apologists have blamed excessive drug and alcohol consumption for this clearly premeditated act of hate speech.
It's not the side effects of the cocaine.
But that doesn't seem to be the core of the problem. According to Kieran Tyler of The Guardian, Clapton reasserted his approval of Enoch Powell in this edition of Uncut magazine in 2004. Unfortunately, I can only find a snippet of the interview on Uncut's website, which mainly just talks about how he stole his entire style from Jimi Hendrix and Buddy Guy. This blog post from 2010 points out the fact that Rolling Stone magazine has clearly avoided this topic for decades, instead choosing a mutually beneficial relationship with a known racist and abuser. But all that would change when Eric Clapton came out against COVID restrictions. In December 2020, Eric Clapton released his anti-lockdown anthem, Stand and Deliver, co-written by fellow washed-up rocker Van Morrison. The proceeds for this song go to his Lockdown Financial Hardship Fund, which aims to assist musicians who are struggling amid the coronavirus pandemic. Need I remind you that Van Morrison's net worth is $90 million. Eric Clapton is worth $450 million. I am not going to listen to this song. In 2021, Clapton returned with This Has Gotta Stop, featuring incredibly poignant lines like, "I've been around a long, long time, seen it all, and I'm used to being free." I'm not going to listen to that song either. When searching for recent Eric Clapton appearances, I happened upon this interview from August 2023 titled Robbie Robertson, RFK Jr., and Other Controversial Stuff. Eric Clapton is a far-right nationalist. It's not a debate. He believes that England, and probably to some extent America, should be white ethno-states that fetishize people of color while maintaining a strong anti-immigration stance. Knowing this, George Harrison, Paul McCartney, and Ringo Starr have all remained very close with him, with Paul collaborating with him as recently as 2013. And hey, why wouldn't they? Clapton is a world-renowned Hall of Famer who has faced zero consequences for the violent behavior that helped usher in a neo-fascist movement. He hasn't changed at all since 1968, and I think that's why the Beatles like him so much. He's a familiar breath of stale cigarettes and pig-headed misogyny in a world where people now care about things like public health and the well-being of others. Now, some will say that music isn't supposed to be about social justice or helping oppressed people. It's about being edgy and pissing off your parents. Okay, but what happens when you become the parent? Do you just keep finding authority figures to complain about? Or do you, I don't know, mature and start taking responsibility as an adult to make the world a better place for your children? Well, if you're Eric Clapton, you neglect your kid to the point where you let him fall out of a 53rd story window and then write a weepy adult contemporary song about it that reinvigorates your career. You're not going where he went, you fascist piece of shit. Good night and good luck.